Hello, fifth graders. I'm Dr. Delosier and I'm ready to read with you. We've been working on identifying the theme of a text and connecting the characters' responses to challenges to support that theme. The text, Night of the Spadefoot Toads, has helped practice these reading strategies. Let's review what we have read and continue with the reading practices. In chapter 16, Ben's parents and teacher learned that he had not completed his assignment. His teacher responded to the challenge of Ben struggling with the assignment due to the struggle of learning to adapt to his new surroundings and decided to encourage Ben to research the ecosystem where they live in Massachusetts, his new environment. Since Ben had told her he had lost interest in the Sonoran Desert, do you think Mrs. Kuchar thought changing his study would help him adapt to his new environment? We also still have the plot regarding Mrs. Tibbetts' property, and in particular, saving the vernal pools and the Spadefoot Toads. What do you think will happen? Will Ben be successful in saving that ecosystem? We are going to learn how an author uses details to develop a story. Our learning targets today are: we will determine the theme of a story from the details in the text. We will do this by identifying the characters' responses to challenges. We will be successful when we discuss and reason evidence that supports a theme. And we are going to compare and contrast two or more characters in a story, drawing on specific details in the text. We will identify how characters respond in different situations, including by looking at the action and dialogue of the characters. We will be successful through discussion. Let's get started. Chapter 17. When Ben gets home, he grabs a snack and is about to head back outside when his mom calls out, "There's something for you in your room." He runs down the hall and finds a big box sitting on his bedroom floor. Its corners are squashed, and Ben recognizes his own handwriting on the side, "Ben's room." Finally, he says to himself. He drops his backpack, rips the tape off the box, and pulls back on the flaps. His mom comes in and leans against the door, watching him. His first thought when he looks in the box is that there's not as much stuff as he remembered. What's missing? He pulls out the little pill bottles holding insects, the plastic food container that holds the snake skin, the posters of desert animals he folded so carefully when he packed in Tucson, and finally, down at the bottom, the books and his collection of rocks. "Happy?" his mother asks. "Yeah," Ben says. His mother smiles and leaves the room. Ben looks through the stuff again. It's all there, but it still feels like something is missing. It's not as exciting or comforting as he thought it would be. All of the things in the box seem like parts of his life from so long ago. Some other time, some other place. He's glad he got the box back, but it doesn't seem so important now. He puts the stuff back in the box and runs to the kitchen. His mom is busy with something on the other side of the room, so Ben grabs a handful of cookies and heads outside. He thinks about going by the trail, but decides his bike will be faster. He wants to get to Mrs. Tibbetts' house before anyone else does, but by the time he gets there, the driveway is filled with cars. All right, I'm going to pause just for a minute because I would like to ask you, how do you know Ben is not very interested in his box of desert souvenirs from Tucson? Can you find 3 details? Yes, the text says that Ben thought it wasn't as exciting as he expected. It also states that it doesn't seem as important now. There is another detail, and that is he packs his box back up and goes to Mrs. Tibbetts' house. I think those are all details that show us he's not that interested in the box anymore. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's start with the very last sentence on the very last line. Mrs. Tibbetts' old station wagon sits next to her sister-in-law's car. Parked behind them are a bright green van with the name of a real estate company on the side and a blue car with a state insignia on the door. Do you know what insignia is? What root word do you see? sign. So an insignia would be something like a sign on the side of a car, right? Yep. I know you've seen those before. I hope you're connecting. Let's continue. Ben's heart races. He knocks on the front door. When nobody answers, he walks around to the back and finds 4 people standing in a semicircle looking at the back field. Sandwiched between Mrs. Tibbets and her sister-in-law are a tall lady in a business suit with a purse slung over her shoulder, and a short, stocky man in a brown windbreaker, an ancient green baseball cap, and hiking boots. He's holding a clipboard under one arm. No one's talking. They're just standing there looking like they'd rather be somewhere else. They all turn when they hear Ben come up. "Hello, Ben," says Mrs. Tibbets. "Hi," Ben says back. "This is Tabitha Turner, my sister-in-law, and this is Adela Carrot, her real estate agent. And this, you must be the young man who called," says the man in the green cap. His face breaks into a grin. "I'm Hank Lindsay," he says, holding out his hand. Ben's dad has always told him you can tell a lot from someone's handshake, and Ben likes the friendly way Hank Lindsay shakes his hand. "Hi, Mr. Lindsay." So let's think for a minute. Ben is familiar with Tabitha Turner, Mrs. Tibbet's sister-in-law, and even though he hasn't met the real estate agent, he understands why she is there. I have a challenge question for you. Compare Ben's reaction to Tabitha Turner and Adelia Garrett, the real estate agent, to Ben's reaction to Hank Lindsay. Why do you think there is a difference in his reactions to them? Let's go on. The real estate agent looks at Ben and Mrs. Lindsay like she thinks they don't belong here, but Ben isn't leaving. Not now. Then Mrs. Tibbet's sister-in-law speaks up. "Excuse me, but I'm still mystified as to why this boy felt free to invite a person from the state onto my property." "I spoke with Mrs. Lindsay too, Tabitha," Mrs. Tibbet says. "I told him he should come." Tabitha Turner sniffs and shakes her head. "Well," says Mrs. Garrett, "this is certainly a beautiful piece of property. It has terrific possibilities." She gives Hank Lindsay a tight little smile. There's an awkward moment of silence, and Ben is glad he doesn't have to do anything but stand there and be a kid. "Well," Mr. Lindsay says, taking out his clipboard, let's go have a look." "It's over here," said Mrs. Tibbets. "The pool is down the path on the other side of the garage." She leads the way and everyone follows behind her in a straggly line. "What is in there?" Mr. Lindsay asks, nodding to the empty cages beside the garage. "Snakes," says Mrs. Tibbets, hurrying toward the trailhead. "My husband was a herpetologist." I'm going to pause, guys. What do you think a herpetologist is? Think about it. Use some context clues. "I know," Mr. Lindsay says. "I met him several times. He knew his stuff." Tabitha shakes her head and mumbles something to Mrs. Garrett as they try to keep up with the others. Swallows swoop overhead and a mockingbird calls from the branches of a tree in the back field. "This is an interesting piece of land," Mr. Lindsay says. "There are several different habitats, but there's that meadow behind the house, and it looks like there's an outcropping of granite over there." "And a vernal pool," Ben says hopefully. The real estate agent swats at the gnats flying around her head. As they enter the woods, the canopy of leaves above them casts splotchy shadows on the forest floor. "It's a little wet back here," Mr. Lindsay says. "I don't know if you could build on this part." So I have a question on this slide. Why does Ben interrupt the conversation with, "and a vernal pool"? How do you know that? "It's always wetter in the spring," the real estate agent says, treading carefully to avoid getting mud on her shiny shoes. It takes a while for this odd mix of hikers to get through the woods. Mr. Lindsay, Ben, and Mrs. Tibbets stop several times on the path so the other two women can catch up. When they near the vernal pool, Ben runs ahead. It's almost like he wants to warn the pool that people are coming. But when he gets to the big rock, he stops and stares. There's no pool there. He can't believe it. It's completely dried up. If he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, he would never believe there was a pool here only a few days ago. Now it's just a little dip in the ground, surrounded by rocks and trees and leaves casting a deep shadow where the pool had been. Small yellow-green bunches of leaves are shooting up out of the spot. Ben hears the others approaching and turns to face them. "This is the pool," he says, hoping Mrs. Lindsay can see something that isn't there. "This is where the Spadefoots come." "But there's nothing here," exclaims Mrs. Garrett. "Not even a puddle." "But it was here," Ben says. "It's been here every year for thousands of years." "Oh, really?" says the real estate agent. Mr. Lindsay squats and looks at the site. They all watch him. I'm going to pause for just a minute. So how do you think this is going to affect Mr. Lindsay's decision with the vernal pool not being there anymore? I agree. I think Ben is fearful that because the vernal pool is dry, Mr. Lindsay will not be able to save the habitat. Let's see what happens. I'm going to start at the last paragraph again, so please continue reading with me. Mr. Lindsay squats and looks at the site. They all watch him, and he scratches the back of his head, then pushes aside the plants growing up out of the dark, rotting leaves. He presses a finger into the damp earth. He's like a doctor examining a patient. "What do you think?" Ben asks. Mr. Lindsay stands up and looks around with his hands on his hips. He steps back several yards, then walks in a circle, checking the ground several times. He scribbles something in the notebook attached to his clipboard. "Well, it could be a significant site," he finally says. "It's a vernal pool for sure." "But there's nothing here," Mrs. Garrett insists. "Surely you can't say this is a significant site when there's no sign of a pond here." "Well, yes, ma'am, there are signs. I can tell it's a vernal pool." Ben smiles and glances over at Mrs. Tibbets. Her eyes are on the place where the pool once was. So is Ben starting to get hopes again? Yeah, it's kind of like the climax is going up and down and up and down. Wonder what's going to happen. Let's keep reading. But everyone turns to look at Mr. Lindsay. There are two problems. First, we'd have to document that it contains threatened or endangered species that need vernal pools to survive. "We saw the Spadefoots," Ben practically shouts. "Mrs. Tibbets has seen them for years." "Right," says Mr. Lindsay, "but we'd need proof, pictures or something. It wouldn't have to be spadefoot toads. There are other vernal pool species, fairy shrimp, fingernail clams, and caddisfly larvae, for example. But everything has to be well documented before we can stop any development." "Just what I've said all along," says Mrs. Garrett. "You can't hold us up from selling something without proof. I've got a buyer and an owner who is ready to sell. End of story." "But Mr. Lindsay," Ben begs, "can't you just hold off the builders until we can get the proof?" "Excuse me, young man," Mrs. Turner says, really stewing now. "Will you please stay out of this? You have no say here." "Leave him be, Tabitha," Mrs. Tibbet snaps. Everybody shuts up and stares at her. "Ben, let Mr. Lindsay talk." Mr. Lindsay takes off his cap, smooths back his thinning hair, then replaces the cap on his head. "There are other problems. In order to be certified as a vernal pool, the site would have to be filled with water for at least 2 months. and I'm not sure this pool would be big enough to qualify. But that's not fair, Ben blurts out. The Spadefoots don't care how big it is. They need it to live. Gloria, Mrs. Turner says to her sister-in-law, glaring at Ben like he's a dog that needs to be disciplined. Can't you do something about the boy? He's right, Mr. Lindsay says. It's not fair, but it's the way the laws are written. There are Spadefoot toads here, Mrs. Tibbets says. And they are endangered, Ben adds. I know, Mr. Lindsay tucks his clipboard back under his arm. It's a weird little loophole in the law. Spadefoots are particularly difficult to document since they don't need a very big pool. So, the real estate agent says, it's not really a problem. Mr. Lindsay looks at her and sighs. Unless you're a Spadefoot. Ben feels tears welling up in his eyes. He can't believe there's nothing anyone can do. Without another word, the adults turn and head back toward the house. Ben falls in beside Mrs. Tibbets, and she places her hand on his shoulder. It's a long, quiet walk. When they reach Mrs. Tibbets' yard, they all stand in the driveway. Mrs. Garrett breaks the silence. So, Mr. Lindsay, things have not really changed in terms of what can happen to the land. There's nothing to prevent its sale. No, Mr. Lindsay hesitates. But if there was real concern about preserving an endangered habitat, it's possible that the sale could be made to a group that would protect it. The Nature Conservancy or the land trust in the town might buy the land. They would pay you and then not develop it. But not at its full value, the real estate agent says. Development is really the way to get the most out of this piece of property. Selling it to some nature group wouldn't be nearly as profitable. Not as profitable as putting up a bunch of houses. No. So it seems like there really is no hope to save the land. What were some of the reasons given in the text that it seems hopeless? What are some details that demonstrate this? What questions are you asking now? Let's continue. He looks over at Mrs. Turner. But I'm sure they would offer a fair price. It's a special piece of land, even if the state can't protect it. Mrs. Tibbets keeps her eyes on her sister-in-law. Mrs. Turner stares down at the driveway pavement with a straight mouth, arms folded across her chest. Thank you, Mr. Lindsay, she says. We appreciate your time. Mrs. Tibbets blows a short, exasperated burst of air out of her mouth. Her sister-in-law frowns. Selling the land helps you too, Gloria. Don't make me the bad guy. It's silent again. Mr. Lindsay takes his wallet out of his pocket and pulls out a card. He hands it to Mrs. Turner. She looks at the card like it's poison, but she takes it. If you have any questions or concerns, he says, give me a call. He shakes hands all around and comes to Ben last. It's a pleasure to meet you, young man. I'm going to pause for just a minute. I want you to compare and contrast how Mrs. Tibbets and the real estate agent have treated Ben compared to how Mr. Lindsay and Mrs. Tibbets treat Ben. What are the similarities and what are the differences? And why do you think they are that way? Can you connect? Let's keep reading. Ben smiles weakly and shakes his hand, but he's hugely disappointed in this man who should have been able to make things right. As Mr. Lindsay drives away, Mrs. Turner and the real estate woman stand by the van talking quietly. I'm going inside, Tabitha, Mrs. Tibbets calls. We'll talk later, her sister-in-law answers. Ben and Mrs. Tibbets watch as the car and the real estate van pull out of the driveway. All right. Before we go on with the assignment, I do have a question for you. How do you know Ben wasn't happy with Mr. Lindsay? I agree. He thought Mr. Lindsay was going to be able to save the land for the Spadefoot toad. Do you think this is Mr. Lindsay's fault? Why or why not? Another challenge question there. So what I want you to do now is you have been very diligent in paying attention to the details in the story. We've seen how Ben is adjusting to his surroundings through evidence that he wasn't really interested in his box from Tucson, and even packed it back up instead of taking the things out and placing them in his room. We have also seen that he was more interested in going to Mrs. Tibbetts' house, and we have considered how Ben's reaction to the people at Mrs. Tibbetts' house were different. This continues to demonstrate that Ben is adjusting to living in Massachusetts and is also becoming more confident in who he is as a person. Now it's time for you to continue. You should finish reading chapter 17, either with the slideshow or logging into ReadyGen and reading with the online reader. Then use your journal, and after referring back to the text, answer the questions. Be sure to use text evidence to support your answers. I will also have a slide of challenge questions for you. I would like for you to remember to embrace the challenge. Push yourselves just a little more than you normally would. You can do this. You are great scholars. The questions and the slides are at the end of the slideshow. Let me take you to the questions. I'm sorry, there we go. So here are your questions. And then here are the challenge questions. The challenge questions are optional, but it also lends to greater learning. You are awesome, 5th grade. Keep up the work, do your work, turn your assignments in. Love reading with you. We'll read next time to find out what happens.